So this short video lecture is a continuation of a presentation about the Toxic Release Inventory database. The data that is on the screen in front of you pertains to Pennsylvania specifically. I already went over the amount of toxic releases that occurred in Pennsylvania in the previous short video lecture. Now we're going to look at the distribution over time in terms of what happened to that material. So looking at this graphic, it appears that we've stayed somewhat steady with a few ups and downs pertaining to recycling, but in 2014 and 2015 the amount of recycling of toxic materials increased. Then as we look at this graphic, it appears that the amount of disposal of toxic materials actually decreased, which is good. It means that we're finding other ways of dealing with them. In terms of where these materials went, this graph depicts total on-site releases into the land, air, or water in Pennsylvania over a 12-year period. It appears that back in 2003, most of the toxic materials were being released into the air. As you look at this graphic, you can see over time there's a decreasing trend in the amount of material that's released into the air. In terms of the amount of material released to the water, the dark blue section starts to get a little bit smaller and is definitely smaller in the year 2013, 14, and 15 compared to where it was historically back in 2003 through 2007. The amount released on land has pretty much stayed the same if you look at the size of the green square on the graphic, so it doesn't appear that that has changed much. So this depicts where the toxic materials were released, and predominantly it's in the air, even though that amount has decreased over time. Followed secondly by releases onto the land, and thirdly releases into the water. Now, in terms of Pennsylvania, the top 5 facilities that dispose of toxic materials or release toxic materials are listed on the left side of the screen here. It looks like there's a primary metal industry known as Edgar Thomson plant, and most of those materials were disposed of off-site. The Homer City Generation LP electrical utility was ranked second in the amount of toxic releases, and it looks like a majority of theirs was released into the air, followed by land. The Conemaugh Power Plant is an electric utility. Again, it's almost split evenly between releases to the air and releases to the land. And a petroleum industry plant, Clairton Plant, air and water were the two medias that they released toxic materials into. And then a steel corporation in Butler, most was released onto the land, with some being sent for off-site disposal. So this differs from the United States data. If you recall from the previous lecture for the United States, the top 5 facilities by total disposal or other releases were primarily metal industries, metal mining industries. For Pennsylvania, it's primarily electric utilities and petroleum, and then primary metal industries. Now, in terms of what is being released, this pie chart on the left depicts what is being released into the air, and according to this, the majority is hydrochloric acid being released into the atmosphere. About 30% is comprised of hydrochloric acid releases into the atmosphere, followed by other category, and then just barely less than that is the sulfuric acid being released into the air. And then ammonia and toluene. Toluene is a constituent in gasoline. So that's what's being emitted into the air, and it's different than what we saw at the national level. Now, there is a similarity with what's being emitted into the water, And nitrate compounds comprise 94% or a majority of what's being emitted into the water. And that does correlate to what we saw for the nation as a whole. Now let's look at the data for Dauphin County from the Toxic Release Inventory. The previous slide I showed you data pertaining to Pennsylvania, and it appears that for the county of Dauphin, which is situated right around Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, about 4.2 million pounds of toxic materials are released into the land, air, or water. This map depicts the general location of these facilities, and it's showing that you have 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 facilities located within Dauphin County. As we look at this graphic to determine where this material is going or what's being done with it, it appears that between 2003 and 2015 we've increased the disposal of toxic materials. The yellow color or treatment was actually more in 2003, 2004, 2005 than what it is currently now in 2015. So it appears that we've decreased our treatment of toxic materials. And then in terms of recycling, our recycling has gone up through 2008, and then it's decreased and increased, and we really don't see an increasing trend continuing on this in terms of the recycling of the toxic materials. Now, in terms of where these materials are being released, it appears that a majority is going into the air. So there could be concern for the air quality in Dauphin County area. Small amounts are going into the water, as indicated in the dark blue, and it doesn't appear that any are being released onto the land. Now, as far as the top 5 facilities that have the largest quantity of toxic release compounds, Durabond Pipe, which is a fabrication metal facility, releases most of theirs to off-site disposal and then air, and they have the greatest amount of tracking for toxic release chemicals. Then you have a company in Steelton, which is also metal. Actually, all of these companies are metal-related companies. In terms of what's being emitted into the air, it looks like xylene is the majority, followed by certain glycol ethers, and xylene is a component of gasoline. It's also known to be potentially carcinogenic, so it's interesting that this is so different from what we saw for the state of Pennsylvania as well as for the nation. In fact, most of these constituents listed here are organic chemicals or synthetically man-made organic chemicals. Now, as far as what's being released into the water, again, this is quite different than what we saw for Pennsylvania and the United States. They both listed nitrate as being the primary item released into the water. Maybe because we're dealing with metal companies, that may be why we're seeing these different constituents here listed with the xylene and the toluene, as well as over here with the zinc and the manganese and the lead. And it's because of all of our facilities are metal processing facilities. So zinc is what is most released into the atmosphere, or into the water, followed by manganese, which is followed by lead compounds. So we definitely have a difference in what's being released into the water and air in Dauphin County when compared to what's being released into the water and air for the state of Pennsylvania. Now, some clarification about the TRI. The TRI does not cover all chemicals or all facilities. The TRI data reflects annual totals, but not the frequency or the duration of the release. And the TRI does not include information about public exposure to chemicals. The goal of the TRI is to eliminate and reduce creation of pollutants. This is known as source reduction or pollution prevention, otherwise known as P2. Historically, we have relied on pollution control, which uses technology to prevent pollutants from entering the environment. These are known as end-of-the-pipe solutions. So we still have pollutants that need to still be disposed of, and it involves regulation and control. A different approach to this is pollution prevention, and this involves changing the production or the materials or both so that pollutants won't be released at all, nor do they have to be dealt with. So, for example, using a catalytic converter versus redesigning an engine. Better products with less waste ends up occurring. I'm also going to share with you the EPI's TRP2 search tool, which helps define which companies are doing pollution prevention techniques in a very specific area. So the TRI has this Pollution Prevention P2 website, which I have on the screen in front of you, and it's an effort to track industry progress in reducing waste generation and moving towards safer waste management alternatives. So they track this information, and they have a search tool that allows us to determine who in a specific area is doing P2 activities. This graphic is a pie chart depicting the number of companies throughout the United States that have reported P2 activities. A total of 2,400 facilities, about 11% of all TRI facilities, reported initiating over 7,500 different source reduction activities. And these activities are broken into the categories listed here. So let's take a look at this. About 3,000 facilities have indicated that they do good operating practices. So, for example, a pesticide manufacturer may validate their rinse procedures to minimize the number of dichloromethane rinse cycles required, hence less wastewater being generated that could contain harmful constituents in it. Or a soap manufacturer changes production schedules to allow for longer run times for similar products in order to reduce the need for diethylanilamine feedstock changeovers, hence reducing the amount of need for a chemical that's considered toxic. About 1,500 companies have done process modifications, 21% of the overall companies. An example of this is a battery manufacturer that upgrades its conveyor system to prevent blockage and loss of cobalt due to contamination. Also, maybe an employee recommendation occurred where a paper manufacturer reduced the volume of methyl isobutyl ketone used by switching to a different process catalyst or a less toxic substance. In terms of spill and leak prevention, about 13% of the companies have implemented P2 activities, and some examples of that would be a petroleum terminal installing spill kits and drain covers in high-risk areas to prevent spills from leaving through stormwater drains. Or maybe a chemical manufacturing facility that worked with a leach detection and repair contractor to monitor their anhydrous ammonia system and reduce emissions going into the atmosphere. And the list goes on. Now, what I'd like to do next is take you to a summary of pollution prevention for Dauphin County specifically. So this part of the TRI lists the various companies and what they've done in order to minimize toxic releases. It looks like these first two are source reductions, and some companies have done multiple source reductions. So what happens with this is you can look through the list. There's about 43 companies within Dauphin County that have implemented various P2 activities. So we're going to click on P2 details. And this then gives you details about what's been released and what changes they've made and the successes of those changes to decrease toxic releases into the land, air, or water. So the toxic release database can give you really specific information about specific companies as well.